In 1970, the entire United States government was 3 hours away from running out of money. Not a company, not a bank, the whole country. And the person who stopped it wasn't a president. He wasn't a general. He was one man, sitting in a private library on 36th Street in New York City, playing a card game while the fate of the American economy hung in the balance. His name was J.P. Morgan. And by the time he died, he controlled more capital than the entire federal government. If you've ever felt like the rules of money are rigged by people you'll never meet, wait until you hear how this man rigged them himself, legally, ruthlessly, and almost by accident. Stick with me for the next 25 minutes because this isn't just a history lesson. Every major move Morgan made, the deals, the bluffs, the ruthless timing, is a playbook that still works today, whether you're closing a funding round in Austin or negotiating a partnership in Chicago. By the end of this, you'll understand exactly how one sickly, awkward kid became the single most powerful private citizen in American history, and what that says about how power and money actually work, even now. Let's start where nobody expects, with a kid who almost never left his bedroom. John Pierpont Morgan was born in 1837 into serious money. His father, Junius Morgan, was already a respected banker with connections stretching from New York to London. But young Pierpont wasn't the picture of a future titan. He was constantly sick, seizures as an infant, rheumatic fever, scarlet fever, migraines that knocked him out for days. On top of all that, he developed a skin condition that left his nose permanently swollen and disfigured. He hated it so much that as an adult, he'd pay portrait painters and photographers to quietly edit it out. The 1800s version of touching up a LinkedIn photo before a big pitch meeting. Because he was sick so often, Morgan couldn't play outside like other kids. So he stayed in and he read, financial statements mostly, alongside long stretches of solitaire. A game he'd play obsessively for the rest of his life, including during two of the biggest financial rescues in American history. While other boys were out running around, this kid was teaching himself how businesses actually work. That isolation built something a lot of successful founders will tell you they had too. An obsessive, almost lonely focus that most people never develop, because most people never sit still long enough to need it. His father saw the potential and pushed hard, sometimes brutally. At 15, Morgan was sent alone to the remote Azores Islands for a full year to recover from illness. At 17, he was shipped to a boarding school in Switzerland, 600 miles from his family. His father wasn't being cruel. He was engineering independence into his son on purpose, forcing him to build resilience without a safety net nearby. And it worked. By the time Morgan started his career on Wall Street as an unpaid clerk, sending detailed financial reports back to his father in London twice a week for over 30 years straight, he already had the discipline of someone twice his age. But here's the part most people skip past. Morgan's first real fortune wasn't built on brilliant investing. It was built during the Civil War, and it's the ugliest chapter of his career. Like a lot of wealthy men at the time, including Andrew Carnegie, Morgan paid $300 to avoid being drafted and had a substitute fight in his place. Then, instead of sitting the war out quietly, he found ways to profit from it. He speculated on Union bonds, betting on how battle outcomes would swing their price. And in one deal that later got him publicly accused of dealing in defective weapons, a scandal historians still call the Hall Carbon affair, Morgan financed the purchase of thousands of outdated rifles at a bargain price, had them modestly upgraded, then sold them right back to the same Union Army at nearly 6 times what they'd been bought for. A congressional investigation later called the men behind that deal worse than traitors. Morgan was only in his early 20s. He'd already learned the lesson that would define his entire career: chaos creates opportunity, and the person who can act calmly and quickly inside a crisis is the person who ends up owning it. That lesson would come back again and again, but next time, it wouldn't just make him rich. It would make him the most important man in the country. Fast forward a couple decades. America's in the middle of the Gilded Age, the fastest wealth explosion the country had ever seen. Rockefeller controls the oil. Carnegie controls the steel. But the railroads? Total chaos. Dozens of companies laying competing lines along the same routes, undercutting each other, driving profits into the ground. It was the 1800s version of a market flooded with copycat startups all racing to zero, except this time, over 2/3 of the entire USS stock market was tied up in these companies. So when the railroads bled, the whole economy felt it. Morgan saw what nobody else did. Instead of just investing in railroads, he started sitting on their boards, restructuring their leadership, forcing rival companies to stop competing and start cooperating. People started calling it Morganization. Today, we'd call it activist investing or a hostile takeover, but with a twist. Morgan wasn't there to loot the company and walk away. He was there to fix it, then keep a permanent grip on it for decades. The moment that made him a legend happened on a boat. Morgan owned a yacht called the Corsair, and in 1885 he invited the presidents of 2 massive rival railroads, the Pennsylvania and the New York Central, onto it for a friendly cruise up the Hudson River. Once they were on board, he told the crew not to dock until the 2 men agreed to stop competing on the same routes. He essentially held two of the most powerful executives in the country hostage on his own yacht until they signed a truce. It worked. It's remembered today as the Corsair Pact, and Morgan walked away with a six-figure commission plus $1 million profit on top of it. If you've ever heard a negotiation coach tell you to control the room, control the timeline, and never let the other side leave until there's a signature on paper, Morgan was doing that on a private yacht in 1885, decades before anyone wrote a book about it. Here's your first rehook, because it only gets bigger from here. Everything so far, the railroads, the yacht, the money, that was just Morgan flexing inside private industry. What happened next is the part that should genuinely unsettle you, because it's the moment one private citizen effectively became more powerful than the President of the United States. In 1893, the U.S. government's gold reserves were collapsing. Back then, American currency was backed by gold, and investors, mostly European, were cashing out their dollars for physical gold at an alarming rate. The Treasury was hemorrhaging roughly $2 million a day. If reserves hit zero, the government would default on its own debt. Morgan sent a plan directly to President Grover Cleveland. The president said no, choosing instead to try selling public bonds, a slower process that Morgan knew the country didn't have time for. So Morgan did something almost unthinkable. He traveled from New York to Washington, D.C., and told the president's staff he would not leave the building until he got a meeting. When he finally sat across from Cleveland in his cabinet, a Treasury official interrupted with news that reserves had dropped to $9 million. Morgan calmly told the room he personally knew of a $12 million draft that, if cashed that same day, would wipe the government out completely by 3 o'clock that afternoon. Cleveland turned to him and asked what he suggested. Morgan proposed a private syndicate of American and European investors, essentially himself and his network, buying gold and selling it directly to the Treasury, bypassing Congress entirely through an old wartime legal loophole. Cleveland signed. Within 22 minutes, the deal was finalized in New York. Within 2 hours, it was done in London. One private banker had just personally propped up the credit of the United States federal government and taken a healthy commission for doing it. Think about that. Not a bailout from Congress. Not the Federal Reserve. It didn't even exist yet. One man's personal Rolodex saved the country's finances. That's the kind of leverage most founders spend an entire career trying to build, and Morgan had it before he even turned 60. A few years later, in 1901, Andrew Carnegie decided he was done. He wrote a number on a piece of paper, the price he wanted for Carnegie steel, and sent it to Morgan's office. Morgan glanced at it once and agreed on the spot, $480 million. It remains one of the largest business acquisitions in American history when you adjust for the era, and it instantly made Carnegie the richest man in the world. Legend has it that when Carnegie later joked he should have asked for $100 million more, Morgan simply replied, "If you had, I would have paid it." That's not just confidence. That's a man who genuinely knew exactly what he was buying and what it was worth to him. Morgan used the deal to build United States Steel, the first company in history valued at over $1 billion, worth roughly 7% of the entire country's GDP at the time. Picture a single company today worth more than the combined GDP of several USA states. That's the scale we're talking about. Add in his growing control over the railroad industry, at one point over a third of all rail lines in the country, and it's easy to see why people stopped calling him a banker and started calling him something closer to a shadow government. By this point, whispers were turning into open accusations. People weren't just saying Morgan was rich, they were saying Morgan owned the country. And one man in Washington agreed with them completely, President Theodore Roosevelt. Here's your mid-video pattern interrupt, because this is where the story stops being a straight climb and turns into a fight. Roosevelt built his presidency on breaking up exactly the kind of empire Morgan had built. Using the Sherman Antitrust Act, Roosevelt went after Morgan's railroad holding company, Northern Securities, without even warning him first. Morgan rushed to the White House demanding a chance to fix things privately, the same way he always had. Roosevelt refused. "That is precisely what we did not want you to do," he told him. The courts eventually sided with Roosevelt and Northern Securities was broken apart in 1924. Morgan reportedly never fully forgave him for it. When he later heard Roosevelt was going on a hunting trip to Africa, Morgan dryly said he hoped the first lion he met did his duty. It's a brutal lesson a lot of founders learn the hard way, whether they're running a startup in Seattle or a media company in New York. The same instincts that make you unstoppable in a boardroom can make you a target the moment you're powerful enough for a government or a competitor to notice. You. But Morgan wasn't finished. In 1907, a failed copper company triggered a full-blown financial panic. Banks collapsing, brokerage houses folding, a run on deposits spreading across the country in a matter of days. At the time, this was the worst financial panic America had ever experienced. And once again, the government had nobody else to call. Roosevelt authorized $25 million in federal funds and handed control to Morgan. Morgan gathered the heads of every major bank and trust company in New York into his private library, locked the door, and reportedly played a hand of solitaire while they negotiated a bailout plan among themselves through the night. Reporters camped outside for hours, waiting for a verdict. By morning, the crisis was contained. Wall Street cheered him in the streets like a war hero. It was also the last time in American history that one private citizen would ever hold that kind of emergency power over the entire financial system. Partly because of the 1997 panic, the USS eventually created the Federal Reserve in 1913, a government institution built specifically so the country would never again have to depend on one man's personal fortune to avoid collapse. In a strange way, Morgan's greatest rescue was also the reason nobody would ever be allowed to do what he did again. 5 years later, in 1912, Morgan was called before the Peugeot Committee, a Senate investigation into exactly how much power a handful of bankers held over the American economy. The numbers were staggering. Morgan personally influenced more than $22 billion in capital through over 100 corporations and hundreds of board seats, equal to roughly 2/3 of the entire country's economic output. When the lawyer asked him whether commercial credit was based primarily on money or property, Morgan famously answered, "No, sir. The first thing is character." The room reportedly broke into applause. It's the kind of answer that sounds almost naive today, in a world where people compare the influence of figures like Elon Musk over entire industries. But for Morgan, character actually was the currency. His entire business model ran on people trusting his word before they trusted his balance sheet. He died the following year, in 1913, in Rome, at 75 years old. His son later said the stress of the Peugeot hearings contributed to his father's decline. His personal fortune was calculated at around $80 million, a number so much smaller than his rivals that Carnegie reportedly said, and to think he wasn't even a rich man. Roughly half of that fortune was tied up in his private art collection, which included pieces now housed in the Metropolitan Museum of Art, along with items like Napoleon's personal watch and a handwritten letter from George Washington. Morgan's wealth was never really about the number in his account. It was about the size of the network he controlled. And that's a distinction every founder building toward an exit should sit with for a second. So what do you actually take from all of this if you're building something today? Whether you're pitching investors in San Francisco, opening your first store in Denver, or trying to scale past your first 100 customers in Miami. A few things. First, Morgan's biggest breaks all happened during chaos, not calm. The 1893 gold crisis, the 1997 panic, the tangled mess of the railroad industry. Warren Buffett has said something similar for decades since, be greedy when others are fearful. Morgan lived that a century before it was ever a quote people put on t-shirts. Second, he built leverage through relationships, not just capital. The Corsair Pact, the Carnegie deal, the 1907 bailout. None of those happened because Morgan simply had money sitting in an account. They happened because he had spent decades building a network deep enough that people had no choice but to trust him the moment it mattered most. That's not luck. That's compounding trust the same way you compound interest. And third, and this one's uncomfortable, power that isn't checked by anyone eventually gets checked by someone. Roosevelt, the Peugeot Committee, the creation of the Federal Reserve. Morgan built something so large that the entire system had to evolve around him, and then eventually against him. If you're building a business right now that depends entirely on you being the only person who can hold it together, that's not a strength. That's the exact same fragility that ended Morgan's era the moment he passed away. That's the real story of J.P. Morgan. Not just a rich man, but a man who understood that in moments of chaos, whoever stays calm ends up holding the power. If this kind of story helps you think differently about business and money, do me a favor. Hit subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Drop a like if you made it this far, and let me know in the comments, if you had Morgan's leverage for one single day, what deal would you make? Learn, build, grow, succeed. I'll see you in the next one.